Hello, class, and welcome to your module on gender, sexual identity, and schools. As we start this module, I wanted to take a few minutes to pause and reflect. As you move through this module, you'll read a couple of different pieces of scholarship as well as some digital resources that really allow us to dive into this module as we understand aspects of thinking about gender and its implications on the realities of students in schools, as well as sexual identity and how we can think about more inclusive practices for all of those of us who want to be key stakeholders in educational spaces. I want us to take some time to pause and reflect on this quote pulled from a piece that you will read throughout this module. It centers on the idea that stems from the ways in which students engage with gender politics. Also, a piece of that being the extension of thinking about aspects of sexual identity and the ways in which we could potentially perpetuate um, inequities in schooling spaces when we don't attend to acknowledging, or rather prefer to ignore and discuss the realities of seeing students for who they are as they come into the schooling space. And the quote reads, "Gender politics is a subject that many in our schools may prefer to ignore. If we do not begin to discuss more openly the ways in which ascribe power, whether it's on the basis of race, sex, class, sexual orientation, or religion, if we don't acknowledge the ways in which we know that these aspects of identity affect individual lives, we will not be truly preparing our students for citizenship in a democracy." So take some time to think about that quote. Think about that really as the precursor as we move through this module and learn more about the implications and the realities around understanding aspects of gender and sexual identity in schools. Big questions of the module are thinking about how we can better understand how gender shapes schooling realities for students, thinking about the aspect or understanding of co-education in regards to the education of girls and boys or students that are gender nonconforming, right? And where they fit in this narrative around thinking about the co-education of students at the intersections of gender identities. Thinking about in what ways conceptions of human sexuality ultimately have shaped educational practice, in what ways, right? Also connecting back to our own educational histories and how we've seen aspects of human sexuality shaping educational experience. And thinking about the ways in which most consistently, when we think about critical issues in connection to this module, how we attend to the treatment of boys and girls in schools, particularly as we attend to what might be missing and how we come to think about the treatment of these gender identity in school spaces, gender identities in school spaces, as well as how we might also think about connections and issues of sexual identity, particularly being contested in schooling spaces, and why that continues to be really at the forefront of thinking about this aspect of exploration for this module. And as we come to terms with these questions as really the guiding principles for this module, why do we know that schools continue to be the sites of these kinds of conflicts connected to these aspects of identity? And so what I hope that you get as you move through this module, as you think about outcomes, learning outcomes of what you should gain, is to think about these things more concretely, to think about these things explicitly as we attend to our own experiences and understandings of these aspects of identity, and allow ourselves to move towards more inclusive ways of understanding so that we can best support all of our students in and outside of the classroom. So as always, starting with a space of common understanding and setting the foundation for the module, I wanted to take some time to define gender and sex. Oftentimes, this term is used interchangeably when I engage with students, but these two terms mean different things, and it's really important for us to understand that before we move forward. For the sake of understanding in this module, when we reference sex, we're talking about the biological makeup that is connected to how one is born as either distinctly male or female based off of anatomy of the body. or genetic programming rather of the body in connection to what the body naturally releases in connection to male or female hormones that ultimately stimulate some type of physical development in connection to one's reproductive system. So there's a huge attention again to the anatomy of the body when we are referencing sex, the terminology of defining sex. When we talk about defining gender, we're referencing how one make sense of themselves as being either male or female or playing either masculine and or feminine roles in ways as defined as appropriate by one's culture and society. So the important piece to note when we talk about the differences between gender and sex is that gender is a social cultural construct, right? Because it's connected to the ways in which one makes sense of their belonging or being, either male or female, connected to aspect of the ways in which they connect to one's aspect of culture and society. And oftentimes aspects of gender we see in the ways in which things are socially constructed around us. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. I always really like to show this as demonstrative of making sense of aspects of gender, because most traditionally or most consistently in engaging with understanding gender and its connection to being socially constructed, we have challenges thinking about the complexities that really make up aspects of gender. This visualization is something that has developed over time as bringing to life really the spectrum of understanding when we think about gender. And you will see this or some variation of this in actually one of the digital resources that you will watch in this module. But just for us to make sense of understanding more directly how complex gender really is, and how we can make sense of where people connect to aspects of gender when we think about gender identity. So there's four primary areas of thinking about aspects of gender and how people are embody or live aspects of their gender identity. The first being connected to how they see themselves, or also known as being defined as how one would respond to how they see their gender identity, how they name themselves in connection to their gender identity. And one of the things to note in this visualization is the spectrum that people can fall on, and how also, as we see this visualization, the arrows don't stop and they continue to go, because it's really up to the ways in which individuals' lived experiences make sense of that aspect of gender identity as they're thinking about where they fare. So gender identity being connected to how one might feel and see themselves as either woman or man, um, or other aspects, right, of where they might fare in that spectrum of making sense of gender identity. The next is thinking about sexual orientation. So how one might define who they feel they are attracted to, either sexually and or emotionally. And the attention in this component of gender is thinking about the and or of sexually and emotionally. And there are people that fare on having sexual attraction to men or to women, even some to neither, right? And there's a spectrum of understanding there. When we think about sex, we know that biologically there are ways to think about components of identity in connection to female, having the biological connections to aspects of female or male, or even those that are considered to be intersex, right? There's a spectrum there. That's oftentimes a term that individuals are not aware of. And then also the gender expression, right? And how one chooses to express themselves. And these four components could vary and really truly depend on individual identification in each of these aspects of understanding gender. And for this very notion, it's important, again, to think about how we can see and make sense of this through this visual, and how complex it really is. And oftentimes we limit components of gender identity to a binary, and it exists in a much more complex way as we're understanding how our students might show up in our schooling spaces in and outside of the classroom. Some other terms to think about, and you'll do some exploration of language and terminology also in this module, is the definition of trans or transgender. Those are lived experiences or a sense of personal identity that might differ from the way that somebody might be assigned a gender at birth. There are individuals that identify as cisgender. Those are individuals whose lived experiences or personal identity are considered to match the gender that they've been assigned with at birth. And then there's gender queer or fluid. You might hear that language, and that is a way to define or identify with people that feel as if they identify with neither, all, or a combination of gender identities, right? And so fluid gives them the autonomy and the space to be able to name themselves in the ways that they feel most aligns with their aspects of identity. These are just some of the most common ways to understand aspects of gender, and some of the more common terms to understand. I'm hoping that as you move through this module, you will realize how strongly it is for us, strongly important it is for us to understand language, and often the shifting nature of language. And so for us as key stakeholders in educational spaces, to make the necessary space to always be in the space of learning, to equip ourselves with um, the best ways to properly communicate and understand components of identity as our students show up in our spaces. So now that we have a foundational understanding of the differences between gender and sex, and we also have a visualization of making sense of how complex that aspect of gender really is, and thinking about how people can choose to identify and should have the freedom to identify, we need to think about then how we can better understand that social construction of gender that I mentioned on the previous slide, and how we see that show up as early as even conception when it comes to bringing children into society. And at the forefront of that is this idea of gender socialization. And so we've talked about socialization in this course already in other aspects of identity when we attended to aspects of race, but we also are socialized in aspects of gender. And one of the more clear ways to understand that is even in translating our understanding of how we see toys and are and are either pushed towards particular aspects of play, even in connection to the toys that we play with. And so I use this visualization or this connection to the idea of the Barbie versus the G.I. Joe. As we know that historically we've seen aspect of gender socialization starting very early on in from birth all the way through our rearing into our adult lives. We know that there's research that was conducted really in the early 70s that really started to really ingrain and provide the data that supports how we see this show up, particularly as we attend to the ways that in general parents and society really start to reinforce aspects of gender socialization with their children. Where we see that is that oftentimes girls are typically identified immediately as delicate, weak. The ways that we characterize or use terms to describe girls as beautiful or cute or sweet or nice, right? And we see the opposite when we attend to boys and the gender socialization connected to aspects of boyhood, which is connected to reinforcing boys should be strong and alert and well coordinated, right? I've oftentimes had students share narratives of even thinking about walking physically into a children's clothing store and thinking about the language that's actually written on the clothes that are on onesies, right? For little girls, you might see cute and flowers and bunnies. And for little boys, images or language that might suggest that they should be more rugged and rough. And those are aspects of gender socialization, right? They're communicating messages around how it is perceived that girls and boys should show up in spaces. We have seen, particularly as we attend to some growth in toys and in the market of thinking about even aspects of Barbie. I have on this slide, Barbie released back in, I believe, 2018, 2017, gender nonconforming, a line of gender nonconforming Barbies. And so this is an image um, of what those dolls look like. And we have seen a lot more progress around thinking intentionally around how toys really socialize or reinforce oftentimes some of the bias and stereotype that are connected to aspects of gender identities. And so we're making progress in this aspect, but we need to know how pervasive it is as it trickles down into the experiences of children and then sustains itself even as you continue to move in and out of different spaces. We're going to watch a short video that talks about then how we see the extension of that gender bias then that comes from the understandings of gender socialization.
When someone says gender bias in education, most people believe that this only affects female students. In actuality, gender bias in education affects all students. In 1972, a number of educational amendments was passed into law. Among them was Title IX, which was intended to protect students from discrimination based on gender in federally funded educational facilities and activities. This includes both transgender and gender nonconforming students as well. Despite the intentions of Title IX, students of all gender identities still face discrimination in American public schools. A strong misunderstanding in American society and our school system is that if we give girls, trans, and non-binary students a leg up in the current educational atmosphere, the boys will fall behind. However, all genders receive a certain amount of bias against them. Many teachers hold specific expectations of male and female students, and this kind of gendered stereotyping harms everyone. Boys are seen as rowdier and more likely to have behavioral problems in the classroom, thus also making them punished more so than female students. Outside of the classroom, gender norms negatively affect boys' performance in school as well. American society teaches boys not to indulge in anything considered to be feminine. Unfortunately, many boys have considered art, reading, and writing to be feminine subjects, and thus have no interest in either, stating that it threatens their masculinity. This gendering of school subjects has negative effects on all genders. It is not unknown that girls are not encouraged as often as boys to pursue math, science, and technology, as they have historically been considered boy subjects. There is also a false perception that gendered equality is no longer an issue at all, let alone in the school system. Yet, there are still many ways that gender inequality shows itself in the classroom. One of these ways is in who receives the teacher's attention. For instance, teachers are more likely to pay attention and call on male students rather than females. They tend to wait longer for a response from the boys as well. When boys call out in class, teachers are more likely to respond to them instead of reprimanding them. The same is not true for their female counterparts. Girls are also more likely to experience sexual harassment in school. 4 out of 5 young girls report being sexually harassed in some way during school. Even when these incidents occur in front of faculty, only half of them ever have action taken. In terms of special education and gifted education, boys tend to benefit more than girls do. In a 2011 study, researchers found a significant pattern in how teachers refer students for gifted programs. Given the same exact profile for 2 students, one male and one female, teachers were much more likely to nominate the male student for gifted programs, even though the female student shared the same characteristics. They also tended to view the female student negatively and viewed her not ready for gifted programs based on lack of social skills, whereas they viewed the male profile positively and saw him in need of a challenge. In special education, boys are also favored. In the 2000 census, there were twice as many male students in special education than there were female students. Boys tend to act out more in the classroom, and their behavioral issues tend to get them referred to special education more often. On the other hand, girls tend to not cause as many behavioral problems, and their low achievements do not hold high priority with special education referrals. Only once female students start to act out do teachers begin to notice that they have special learning needs. A separate but related concern in education regarding gender bias is bias towards transgender or gender nonconforming students. In 2015, we are seeing an increase in the visibility of these students and an attempt at normalizing this within our society. So how do these students fit into our schooling system? While these students are technically protected under Title IX, many places like District 211 in Palatine, Illinois, continue to violate the law by refusing these students access to necessary facilities. Many school districts have not put regulations or guidelines in place for dealing with transgender and gender nonconforming students. Despite that, we are still moving in that direction, as New York State has put in place a set of guidelines aimed at protecting transgender and gender nonconforming students. In years to come, it is likely that this issue will continue to come to the forefront of discussions of gender bias, equality, and equity in education. So what can we do about all of these issues? Teachers can start by observing how gender bias affects their own classroom and take steps to avoid falling back on gendered stereotyping. We as a society need to take steps to remove the assumptions that there are feminine and masculine subjects and encourage students to pursue subjects despite existing gendered norms. We also need to create spaces where female students are given as much attention as male students and where they feel safe answering questions and participating in class. Safe spaces are also necessary for students who fall outside of gender norms, and we must work together to create them. Gender bias in education is an important topic and one that will not be fixed until we acknowledge the harm it does to us all.
So that gives us a really great overview of seeing the connection between aspects of gender socialization and its translation into the ultimate bias that stems from not challenging or disrupting oftentimes what we've come to experience in and outside of our societal spaces. So as we move forward and think about then how we see this happening more in schools, how do we know, or how can we think about the extension of or more examples connected to aspects of gender bias in schools? Well, what we do know is if we don't disrupt aspects of gender bias, what we ultimately are doing is limiting the opportunities and cutting off potential interests and talents and even intellectual pursuits of students that ultimately can contribute to our society, right? If we think about the ways in the previous presentation where we heard the ways in which male and female students are steered in particular ways based off of gender bias. In what ways are we limiting what opportunities might come from the natural talents, intellectual talents and pursuits that might be missed because we steer students in a particular way? Oftentimes schools take the forefront and really set the precedent for where students see themselves in exploring opportunities and access around exploring and discovering new skills. And if gender bias is at the forefront of that, ultimately we are limiting the opportunities for where students might be able to see themselves as successful. Ultimately that sends a message that certain pursuits are off limits because of aspects of one's gender, and we lose the opportunity for the incredible source of human potential that might come from steering students in a particular way. And that is what we have seen historically happening time and time again around interest and talents and intellectual capacities of students from all different types of spaces. This idea that we limit simply because of bias or stereotype connected to aspects of one's identity. So, what does that mean? It means that we must think about implications for schools in connection to aspects of gender. sexual identity. Gender is so very important. I mean, it's such a huge part of schooling, and educators really have to work. Educators, and I'll say key stakeholders, really have to think about the schooling space and the classroom space as a space that promotes equity for everyone that's in and outside of those spaces. It's an opportunity for key stakeholders to thinking about learning possible behaviors to support gender equity in society, and to really challenge and disrupt some of those perceptions and expectations that are at the intersection of those components of gender bias that we learned about on the previous slide. So another thing to consider then, as we're looking at opportunities to disrupt gender bias, is to also attend to aspects of gender and sexual identity at the intersections. We have always learned about components of identity in this course at the center of who people are and the different parts of themselves that they bring into a space. Gender and sexual identity are also a part of that conversation. Gender is not something that we can ultimately understand alone and apart from other aspects of self. Gender intersects with race, gender intersects with exceptionality, gender identity intersects with sexual identity, and it also intersects with aspects of ethnicity and how people choose to define themselves or see themselves in different spaces. So what do I mean when I'm talking about gender at the intersections? Well, there's lots of scholarship and research that really explores this concept even further, but some examples could be thinking about the experiences of girls at the intersection of aspects of race. So oftentimes it's suggested or assumed that girls of color demonstrate higher achievement levels than boys of color. And so with that bias that we might have about how we feel like we see that show up, what does that mean for the educators that engage and interact with those populations of students? We also know that there's aspects of disproportionality connected to the behaviors of minority males as being highly problematic in and outside of school spaces, oftentimes being more seen as being dangerous and violent for things that are not demonstrative of being dangerous and violent, right? Their intersection of identity at race and gender reinforces a narrative that is extremely biased and stereotypical for who they are, beyond getting to know who they truly are when they come into different spaces. We know when we think about aspects of exceptionality that girls with disabilities tend to be tracked into life skill courses or life skill tracks and home economic courses. And boys with disabilities oftentimes tend to be tracked into vocational courses. So they're immediately kind of omitted from any other aspects of professional aspiration that they might have, because they're seen as just being tracked into life skill or home economic courses. And not that there's anything wrong with those things, but again, that bias around the assumptions of who they are and how they show up in spaces dictates what they have access to for possibilities. And again, what we don't want is for these biases that oftentimes are at the forefront of gender at the intersection to perpetuate and exacerbate limitations and discriminatory practice against students in our schools. So what are our strategies for addressing these types of stereotypes? Because we know they exist. We know that we are socialized into thinking about particular aspects of identities from a certain vantage point. So what are our necessary strategies for thinking about these types of inequities? Well, first, we need to confront and address those stereotypes. We need to acknowledge that they are there, and we need to think about disrupting those moments when we see them show up, and creating space for self-evaluation. Again, that reinforcement of critical self-reflection that has really underscored a huge part of this course. Thinking about constantly being in the space of lifelong learning around how you can best understand information to protect students at intersections of gender and sexual identity, and creating the space again to partner with others that want to do this type of work to reflect on your own practices and experiences so that you do stay in the constant state of learning. You do stay in a space of obtaining new knowledge around culture and statuses and intersections of self, right? So that we can incorporate that new knowledge into our praxis, into our pedagogy as instructors and as key stakeholders in education. It also allows us then in that engagement of self-reflection and in that space of lifelong learning, of constantly seeking new knowledge and allowing ourselves to be and embrace what I like to call intellectual humility, right? This idea that you don't know it all and that there's always space to grow and learn. We allow ourselves to create the opportunity to build upon the assets and the strengths that our students bring into the space. We allow ourselves to really get to know our students personally and individually, rather than ascribing them to aspects of a particular group or a particular aspect of identity that we might be skewed in our understanding of who they are. And we then can build upon the strengths that they bring into the space and allow our engagement in supporting them and advocating for them to be underscored by understanding who they are. And with this positioning and with this frame of thought, we ultimately will create a space for positive role models for all students, to lead them in the exploration and acknowledgement and awareness of multiple perspectives around cultural identities and aspects of self. We'll create a space where students understand the complexities that exist for who people are, and we'll help them think about the idea of a spectrum, right? The range of possibilities that exists for who people are, and really create a space where we simply disrupt this idea that there are opposite ends and that there's a binary. Truly building the capacity to think more critically about aspects and appreciation for gender and all other forms of diversity that students bring into the space. So we're building upon components of student perspectives, particularly in this module as we attend to gender and gender diversity, but ultimately that translates into just how we see people, right? And the complexity of who people are when they come into our spaces. So with that being said, I hope that you enjoy this module. I hope you enjoy the readings and allow it to guide you in better kind of understanding the ways that we could think about the importance of gender diversity and truly understanding components of self when we think about aspects of sexual identity and how students show up in our schooling spaces to create both in and outside of the classroom truly inclusive spaces to support all of our students. Enjoy the module. Bye-bye.